Can you talk to me about the benefits that have been proven whenever it comes to adopting a low carbohydrate diet?
Low carb and ketogenic diets are aimed at improving metabolic health, and there are a lot of diseases and disorders that are at their root related to poor metabolic health in some fashion. Low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets are, I think, the most studied diet at this point. We've seen studies looking at type 1 diabetes management, type 2 diabetes for both management and reversal, so obtaining normal blood sugar levels, reversing insulin resistance, weight loss, and obesity reversal.
Can we talk initially about the whole area of metabolic dysfunction and metabolic disease? I know you're a scientist who works in this particular area. Can you give me what you believe to be one of the main drivers of this epidemic of metabolic dysfunction that we're seeing across the world at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm a bit opinionated on this. There's a lot of different theories as to what's happening, and I don't think we fully understand what's going on. But I think it's safe to say that a large driver of it is the food environment. And I say that because I think there's definitely other aspects that can drive metabolic dysfunction, like smoking, for example. That's an obvious one. Environmental exposures to various things like mold or what have you. But one thing that I've seen a lot in the community is that metabolic therapies don't fix everything, like you won't regrow limbs or anything like that, but it does tend to help a lot with metabolic disorders and the wide spectrum of them that comes with that. And so that suggests to me that there's something in the food environment that is messing with people's health. I don't think it's high carb alone, but I do think that low carb diets are a therapeutic option. And I say that because we have examples of societies that do eat high carb and are, by all measures, fine. So I would look at the things that have entered recently and then also look at what the overlap is between us and ancient Egypt, for example, because they did have cardiovascular disease, they did have diabetes. We saw other metabolic disorders at that point. So it's like, okay, what's the overlap? So they did eat a lot of seeds. Um, I watched a talk from Mike Eads talking about that, which I found really interesting. So seed oils might be a component. The high levels of fructose that we're eating, too little animal foods might be contributing through nutritional deficiencies and stuff like that. And then also the just levels of processing in ways that isn't helpful. So not all processing is bad. I always go towards as much nuance as possible to probably an annoying degree. But some processing is good, like canning, I like that. I like having canned food in my cabinet. It doesn't impact the food in a way that's gonna harm me if I eat a lot of it. But there is other stuff like hyper processing wheat, for example. Again, seed oils are by nature ultra processed. So I think processing that is changing the food in such a way that it is not necessarily compatible with health, is another thing that I tend to look at. So, yeah, I think the answer is I don't know, but I think we have some evidence that helps us get at least in the right area, and that's a good place to start.
Well, a place that you are certainly familiar with is the ketogenic diet or the low carbohydrate approach. And I like to say that anytime I say the ketogenic diet, because the term keto I found tends to trigger people at times, and it can put people off because, well, it's an alien form of terminology to people, especially if they've never heard it before. Whereas you say low carbohydrate approach, it's certainly more digestible for use of a pun. Can you talk to me about just generally speaking, and we can talk about your own experience with the low carbohydrate or the ketogenic approach. Can you talk to me about the benefits that have been proven whenever it comes to adopting a low carbohydrate diet?
Yeah, so what's cool is that low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets are, I think, the most studied diet at this point. So that is very helpful. So we've seen studies looking at type 1 diabetes management. So it's not a cure, but it can help preventing hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. So too low and too high blood sugar in that population. Type 2 diabetes for both management and reversal, so obtaining normal blood sugar levels, reversing insulin resistance. There have also been things looking at weight loss and obesity reversal. There's more information coming out about mood disorders and mental health disorders like schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, which I've had experience with. I have seen some anecdotes in terms of helping to manage OCD, anxiety disorders. I have family members who use it for that. So a wide breadth, and then also epilepsy is a big one. That's one of the earlier cases that we had information on going back quite far. Lipedema has about, I think, over a dozen different studies at this point using therapeutic ketogenic diets. Um, so I could probably continue listing for a long time, but if there is a condition that associates with insulin resistance, then I've seen people starting to look at therapeutic ketogenic diets and metabolic approaches. And for what you said, the reason that you said, I like the term therapeutic ketogenic diet because it kind of emphasizes it's not, a fad diet or anything like that. It's for a health purpose to address some sort of disorder or disease. There's also some weird ones. Like there's some literature a friend of mine, Amber O'Hearn, pointed me to that was using ketogenic diets for urinary tract infections, which is interesting. So, and then I've also seen it looked at more recently for sepsis. So people in the hospital with sepsis, very, very high mortality rate, and a lot of the information interventions we have, they could be better. So we're always looking for additional things we can use for that. So dozens and dozens of different things, which can make it sound kind of woo woo, right? Like, oh, you're saying it cures everything under the sun. But again, the thing to point to is that low carbon ketogenic diets are aimed at improving metabolic health. And there are a lot of diseases and disorders that are at their root related to poor metabolic health in some fashion.
And central to that then is the phenomenon of systemic or chronic inflammation. You also mentioned insulin resistance there. Could you talk to me and the audience about how those tie together? So, if you remove a large portion of these unhealthy carbohydrates that we're talking about from your diet, how then will that impact on the levels of inflammation in your system? And then by extension, your likelihood of becoming a victim of some form of metabolic dysfunction, be it diabetes or obesity or whatever.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I got really interested in because I did see people talking a lot about carbohydrates. And of course, when you're talking about insulin resistance, insulin does play into carbohydrate metabolism and things like that. So, yes, we do see that people with insulin resistance tend to be carbohydrate intolerant, you could say. They see super large spikes in both blood sugar and insulin when eating high carb. And we tend to see that resolve or get better when they eat lower carb. Okay, that's one aspect. But one thing that I don't see as many pay attention to is that insulin resistance and inflammation do go together. So when you get sick, oftentimes you can become insulin resistant as part of the immune response. So that not only goes with things like infection, but also injury. And also, we tend to see this with things like diabetes and obesity. They have higher levels of inflammation, higher levels of insulin resistance. And there's another key piece that I think is important to point out, which is that people talk about visceral fat or the fat essentially around your organs, basically, and how that's the dangerous fat. And the fat that's under your skin, on your limbs, is the healthier fat. But I don't quite see it that way. There's interesting information that I've learned a lot from Gabor Irdosi, who's looked a lot into this and helped form my opinion. But the visceral fat has immune functionality as well. So, one of the drivers of visceral fat accumulation is inflammation in the gut. And with conditions like IBS and Crohn's, we can also see that there's fat wrapping around the inflamed and injured parts of the bowel. And the reason for there to be an immune function is that the immune cells need energy to do their job. And so if you are eating a diet that is irritating your gut, the irritation is going to induce inflammation, and then that's going to induce visceral fat accumulation. And you see that correlating with a whole bunch of bad outcomes. But the reverse of that is if you eat food that doesn't inflame your gut, then you can start to see some of that visceral fat reduction going down because it's not needed as much anymore. So we do see that with low carb and ketogenic diets in the studies that they help reduce visceral fat more than some other approaches like just plain calorie restriction or low fat diets. So that's another hint as to why they might be useful is that they're helping with gut health. And in terms of inflammation and insulin resistance directly, one thing that I find super cool is that inflammation can induce insulin resistance in some tissues like the liver and the fat. And I won't go too deep into it because it's a whole presentation and podcast in itself. But the reason that it does that is because if your liver is insulin resistant, then it will be resistant to the effects of insulin, which is to decrease the production of glucose. And if you're sick, you actually typically want higher glucose because immune cells can use it to proliferate, to create a whole bunch of materials, to energize themselves. So that's why if you have a fever and you test your blood sugar, it's like, oh my goodness, what did I eat? It's super high. What's going on? It's just because you're sick. And on the fat level, the insulin resistance there helps release fat that goes to the liver, and then you can put out these proteins, which can bind to a whole bunch of stuff. They can bind to toxic particles of bacteria, they can neutralize them, they can decrease the amount of inflammation needed in order to combat them. So it's a whole beautiful orchestra. And I think that food does come into play in this because, again, if the food you're eating is causing some irritation, some issue in the gut, and that eventually goes system wide through things like increased gut permeability. So you don't have as strong as a barrier at the gut level, which is one of the first lines of defense against things that you're eating. Because any time you bring things in from the outside, you're bringing in a whole bunch of stuff, bacteria, mold, all sorts of things. So we have multiple layers of barriers. But if that initial barrier gets compromised, then the issue of the increased inflammation, the exposure to a bunch of this stuff before the immune system can handle it increases. And that might contribute to the systemic inflammation that we see in things like obesity and diabetes, and even things like depression has been linked to increased inflammation.
It's extraordinary to me how the simple act of eating food can have ramifications in so many areas of your body. It's a cascade of events in so many different organs. You, as I said at the outset, you're a research scientist in the area of metabolic health, but you ascribe to a ketogenic diet. But that was more probably by accident than by intent, because originally you suffered health issues yourself. Could you talk to me about these health issues that I know began whenever you were in your early teens? And in your background there, you make a reference to lipedema. Could you talk to me about the intersection between your own personal situation? Because I know you went through a weight management program as well, and you lost something like 80 pounds, which is extraordinary, very commendable. So could you talk to me about your own personal experience with this?
Yeah, so I would say my issues started probably around when I was 9 or 10 years old. That's when I started gaining weight. It's also when I started seeing the first evidence of depression coming on. So it started very, very early. I actually have journals from when I was that age, and just reading through them, it's like, oh, that would have tripped some flags. Um, so it started very early and it got increasingly worse, but it was one of those things where because it happened so early, I wasn't necessarily aware of it. Like I knew I didn't feel well. I knew I was gaining weight, but I didn't link it to anything. Like it's just okay, this is how life is. So it essentially continued, pretty much unmanaged. I did try calorie restriction quite a few times, but the problem is that whenever I would calorie restrict, not only would I get really hungry, so it wasn't very sustainable for me, especially over the long term, it would make my mood swings and my depression symptoms worse. So that would end up impacting my relationships. And then it's like, okay, this is doubly not sustainable because I'd like to have healthy relationships also. But when I was 18, I weighed 240 pounds, which is, I think, 100 kilos or so. And I'm 5'2", like 160 something centimeters. So that's a lot on my frame. Um, and I went into a doctor, and basically what I was told is you have high blood pressure, high cholesterol. Diet and exercise isn't going to do anything because I had said I really like to address this with lifestyle if possible. And they said, no, just take this medication basically. Um, and so I walked away from that doctor. I fired him and didn't go back. And I did again try calorie restriction and increasing the amount of exercise I was doing. And I lost 20 pounds, which isn't nothing. But again, I was hungry. It felt very difficult to maintain. I was much more tired and low energy. My mood got worse. And eventually it started coming back on. So then, at that point, I was living in New York, but after a while, I moved back to my parents' place, and I went in at one point, in 2016, and I talked to my mom, and I was like, "I'm gonna try calorie restriction again," like, expecting to get, like, a pep talk or like, "Yeah, you can do it, rah, rah." But what she said is instead of doing that, I've actually been looking into a ketogenic diet for her own health reasons. Why don't we try it together and see how it goes? And initially I was skeptical. Um, but I did end up going online and finding people saying it was helpful and some science to support it. So I said, okay, I'll try it for 2 months. And, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least I can say I gave it a good shot. So I did 2 months of a ketogenic diet. So what I ascribed to was, under 20 grams of carbs per day, um, all whole foods. I didn't eat any of the snack foods. I already knew how to cook, so that wasn't too difficult. As much fat as it took me to be satiated, so I didn't restrict that, and then moderate protein, essentially. And after the 2 months, I had again lost 20 pounds, but the difference was how easy it was. So as long as I ate my ketogenic diet plan, I was losing weight and I didn't have to count anything. My mom actually recommended I read The Obesity Code by Jason Fung because I was talking about, well, I want to combine a ketogenic diet with low calorie. And she's like, no, no, just read this and then don't do that. I was like, okay. So I didn't restrict calories. I was eating to satiation. So I was letting my body tell me how much I should be eating, losing weight. But the big thing was at the 2-month mark, I had this experience. I was in a parking lot for a farm store with my mom because she has a hobby farm. And I had this weird sensation and I didn't know what it was. And so I was trying to like puzzle through it. Like, what is this feeling? And after a few minutes, I realized it was that I was content. I was happy to be there. I was happy to be with my mom. I was feeling grateful for my friends and my boyfriend, now husband. I was grateful for my family. I was not depressed. I didn't have any feelings of depression. And that is something that I hadn't experienced since I was in kindergarten. So that's a big deal. And even talking to, my boyfriend back then, I was talking about, like, I was losing weight and all this type of stuff, but I was like, eventually it could be that this isn't gonna work anymore because even though I was feeling better about how I was starting to look and losing weight and feeling a little bit more confident, the other side of me was like, "It's only a matter of time until this stops working." And I was trying to, like, warn him, and he was like, "I liked you before, I like you now, but the big difference to me is that you seem like you're happy. So, if you regain all the weight, but you stay happy on this diet, that's a win. Like, I just want you to keep doing it for that reason alone." So, I had really good social support, I would say. Um and so after that 2 months with the depression symptoms in apparently complete remission, at that point I was like, "Okay, I guess this is forever now," because if things changed when I went on this diet, presumably they're going to change again if I go off of it. So I will continue this forever. I had no problem with that. I was enjoying my food. It wasn't difficult for me. It was definitely a skill, but there's plenty of recipes and stuff online and good community and all that type of stuff. So fast forward. So that was in 2016. So fast forward to 2020. I did a experiment where I was doing 2 weeks of fasting, water fasting, and then a week of adding in pure fat, just to look at the differences between those two. And on social media, I had posted two pictures. One was before I started the experiment, one was during. And at this point, like you said, I had lost 80 pounds. So I was significantly lower in weight, but I wasn't like super skinny. Like my waist size had normalized, but I would never define myself as skinny. But I had posted these pictures, and three different women reached out to me privately and said, "Have you ever looked into lipedema? Because it looks like, you have some indicators that might be going on." And my response was, "I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it, but I will talk to my doctor about it." Um, and I didn't really mind. I thought it was interesting, but I had no clue. So I talked to my doctor about it. I ended up going on PubMed and looking through a whole bunch of stuff on it, reading papers on it. And it's like, oh, this might explain some things. But I was also on the other side of things, like, no, no way. Like, I'm just, seeing patterns where they aren't there. It's probably not what I'm dealing with. But my doctor ended up referring me to a specialist who said, yes, this is a very clear cut case of lipedema. And for people who don't know, lipedema is a lymphatic and fat disorder. So it impacts the fat tissue as well as the lymphatics, which helps remove fluid from the tissues. Some of the common signs are disproportionate fat gain, typically in the lower body. It can also be in the arms, especially the upper arms. Um, that fat also has some interesting qualities to it in that it scars. So when people with lipedema go on weight loss diets, for example, including ketogenic diets to an extent, they may lose in the torso, in the face, but their legs may not change, or they may disproportionately change. So in my case, my waist size normalized, like I said, but my legs, my arms were still big. And it also tends to come with swelling in the areas that are affected. So that could present as feeling like your legs are very heavy, very tight, like concrete kind of. Um, it can also come with the distribution of fat is kind of unique in that it will not impact the hands and feet unless there's another condition involved, which can result in something called cuffing, which is basically you've accumulated tissue on the leg and the calf, but then it cuts off at the ankle. And you could have this like little bulging, or it could even be a fold of tissue at the ankle. I have that to a minor degree. I'm very early stage, and luckily with a ketogenic diet, which I'll talk a little bit about later, I've stayed there, which is good. Um, and then also pain is another big factor with lipedema. So the areas that are impacted, the legs and the thighs and the arms, can be very sensitive, but also painful. So it could be painful with pressure. It could be a pet sitting on your lap. It's like, oh my God, it feels like there's broken glass in my legs. It could be bumping into things. Easy bruising also comes along with it. And that scar tissue, um, this is something when I'm at conferences, if I'm talking to doctors or people who are interested about it, it's like, here, feel my arm. Because the scar tissue causes this like pebbly, bumpy, lumpy feeling within the tissue because you have soft fat and then hard scar tissue. So you can feel it in there. So all of those things come together to form lipedema. It's almost exclusively women. There are a couple case reports of men with lipedema. Usually, from what I've seen in those, it comes with a hormonal imbalance, so low testosterone, high estrogen in those men. So there's clearly something going on with that, but the differences between men and women on average includes connective tissue, where we grow fat, how we grow fat, a whole bunch of different stuff. Um, so got diagnosed, and in preparation for that appointment, I had been reading through PubMed, so research studies on lipedema. And one of the things that I came across was this paper by Catherine Sayo and Leslie Keith, which said, ketogenic diets might be a helpful intervention for lipedema. And I was like, I'm already doing that. Great. Doing doing great. I've been on it for several years now. And on the entry survey for the appointment for the diagnosis, they ask a whole bunch of things, basically screening questions for do you likely have lipedema or not. And for a whole bunch of them, I would answer like, not right now, but before a ketogenic diet, yes, I did have this issue. Like, I did have very sensitive limbs, especially my arms, which is where most of like the highest proportion of lipedema tissue is, the most amount of scar tissue. All of that is in my arms. Um, and even just someone like touching my arm to get my attention would be painful. And after a ketogenic diet, that was gone. So the pain that I had been getting with lipedema was gone before I even knew it was anything weird. Like, it's a gradual transition, so I just didn't think about it. I don't think about many things, I guess, as they're happening. But it was I'm glad I found a ketogenic diet when I did, because one of the issues with lipedema is that if it's not properly managed, if it's allowed to continue without intervention, then it can get progressively worse. So the amount of tissue that accumulates increases, the pain can get worse. Some people who may not have had pain initially may start to experience pain. And some trigger points can be puberty. So already went through that by that point, but also pregnancy and then menopause. So catching it before two of the trigger points, I think, is something I'm very grateful for, because it means I can go into those events with lipedema in mind and kind of think about, okay, how am I going to manage this when I start a family? Like, it does add a negative tinge to thinking about pregnancy, but I mean, I'm I'm much happier to go in informed than be caught off guard. And with lipedema, it is worth mentioning, besides the diagnosis and learning a ton about it, I have joined the Lipedema Project as a research specialist. So I help with publishing papers and putting presentations together and helping raise awareness of it at low carb events, things like that. But one of the things we do recommend is a holistic approach. So not just nutrition, but also things like compression garments, manual lymphatic drainage, a type of massage that helps get some of that excess fluid out of the tissue. And also social support, psychological support, emotional support, all of it, all in one, because it does impact your life in every single way. Not only the physical symptoms, but when you appear like you are obese, even if it's just because you have lipedema, people do treat you differently. And that can include doctors, it can include loved ones in some cases, random people you meet on the street, how you interact with the world. So it is something that can really impact people, and they need a level of support beyond just, okay, we're going to look at your symptoms and help you with those, and then you're on your own.
Talk to me about the sustainability of the diet that you're on then, because whenever I talk to people about the low carb approach or the ketogenic diet, people say to me, "Oh, but it's not realistic, and it's very challenging to stay on a diet that you extricate the vast majority of your carbohydrates from." Because let's be honest, the standard Western diet or the standard American diet, which is being exported basically all over the world, practically at this stage, is comprised of predominantly carbohydrates. So talk to me about what has worked for you as far as making a low carbohydrate diet sustainable.
Yeah, so I think the sustainability question is interesting, because in order to evaluate whether something is sustainable or not, you have to look at where the pressure points are. So for me, even in the beginning, I would be looking at this, especially after I decided to do it long term, of what am I struggling with? What don't I like? And what of that can I change? Because if you decrease the barriers of anything, then it makes it easier. So one of the things I really don't like doing is I don't like tracking. I don't like counting. I don't like looking at how many carbs I'm eating. Like, occasionally I will if I'm troubleshooting something, but on the whole, I do not wanna do it. And so that was a pressure point for me. So very, very early in, my mom encouraged me not to calorie restrict, and that worked for me. Might not work for everybody, I don't know. But the other aspect was I would go online and look at charts of here's the lowest carb vegetables, here's the lowest carbs fruits, here's, pretty much any animal product except milk, go for it, all of that. And ultimately, that resulted in me not having to count and not having to track. And then also going over to recipes where they've already done the calculations in it. So I can just make the recipe and eat it and not have to worry about it. So that was another crutch that I used. Eventually, I learned how to cook a low carb diet because I grew up cooking. We had to cook a meal once a week as part of the family. So each kid had to cook a meal, um, which helped mom, I'm sure. But so I already knew those skills. If I didn't know how to cook, it would probably be more difficult. But there are resources online to help people do that. Um, and so cooking my own food, the first meal that I made that was keto, was saag paneer. We had a recipe that we had gotten from a local restaurant, and I just looked at it, swapped out a couple ingredients, and it was already low carb. So it's like, okay, well, that was easy. And so in terms of sustainability, for me, the main thing is not having to track, not having to count anything. That's mostly skill, skill and knowledge that you build up over time. And then palatability. So if I don't like something, I don't eat it. I try to make sure that my meals fit my preferences as much as possible. So maximizing the pleasure factor of every meal that I eat, if possible. Sometimes I do get lazy and I'll have like some burger patties with tomato and onion on them or something. But for the most part, I do try to make good tasting food. Restaurants are actually, at least in the US, pretty easy. A lot of the fast food places will offer like lettuce wraps. When I'm traveling in Europe, haven't had any issues. So, usually once a year I go to Sweden to visit my husband and his family and haven't had any issues there. Usually it'll be fried or not fried, but served with like some sort of potato. And I'll either just ask not to have that, like no sides, just the main dish, which is usually meat of some sort and some sort of vegetable. Or if it comes with that, I just won't eat it. Um, so yeah, I think like a lot of things, like changing your diet in any way, it can be difficult. I think other things that helped me were that I did have a really good social support system. So my mom went on a ketogenic diet the same time I did. So we would cook meals together. We would give each other moral support. We would check in with each other. That is very helpful. And there's been studies on that for people who've maintained weight loss over time. One of the factors is having social support, whether it's within the family or an outside community. I did get involved with the ketogenic community. That's why I got involved with research in the first place. So I did have that as well, where it starts out you're getting advice, you're going there for moral support, and eventually, if you're there long enough, you can start giving other people advice and helping them troubleshoot, and that can help keep you connected in as well. Um, another thing, one thing I do see come up a lot is the affordability of it. Mom and I both noticed that the amount of money we were spending on food after we went low carb decreased dramatically. So, um, haven't had an issue with that. I'm a bit of a penny pincher when it comes to food, so I'm always like clipping coupons and looking at what's on sale and all of that. Same exact process for being on a ketogenic diet. I just look at what's on sale at the grocery store, stock up if it's something I use a lot. Um, and that is actually how I keep my food budget as low as possible is being low carb. So I don't want to dismiss the sustainability thing is the thing. So for me, I specifically went about it in a way so it would be sustainable and I paid attention to where I was having issues. And I would encourage anybody who wants to do it long term to do the same thing. So connect in with the community, make sure you have some form of social support, make sure you have access to resources like recipes and guides and things like that. And then also, as you're going through it, pay attention to the aspects where it feels like a slog. It feels like you're really struggling. It feels like it's difficult. I don't like eggs. Why do I have to eat eggs all the time? Don't eat them. Like, find, don't try to brute force it. Because often, at least in my experience with diets, you are trying to brute force it. You're trying to white knuckle it through. And if you're doing something long term, that is straight up not going to work. You will eventually run out of willpower. You will eventually get sick of it. And so you have to navigate in a way that is respectful and compassionate towards yourself and making it easier, more pleasurable, more affordable, um, and just figuring out what your pressure points are, I think is the main thing. And that's true of anything like vegan diets, paleo, anything. As long as they're eating even slightly differently from the societal norm, that is going to have to be something that you address.
So this version of the ketogenic diet that you're on, this therapeutic ketogenic diet, is essentially it's made up of very low carbs, as you said already. It's higher in fat, and there's a protein element too. When it comes to the fat content, for people out there who are looking to ascribe to a lower carbohydrate diet and are looking to do so in order to lose weight, it seems almost a contradiction that they want to lose weight, but on this diet they're increasing their fat intake. How do you square that? And then how do you broach the subject then of cardiovascular health and that elephant in the room, which is cholesterol levels, which is always a concern that people will bring up?
hmm Yeah. So in terms of the fat content, I personally eat a very high fat diet. So about 85% fat by calorie. That's about 2 to 1 by macronutrient gram. So I eat very, very high fat. That is not necessary for everybody. In terms of weight loss, I was still eating about 80% fat. It was slightly lower back then. Um, 80% fat while I was losing weight. And I do tend to get more satiated with higher fat. I tend to have more energy. And I think it makes sense if you look at obesity as a symptom of metabolic dysfunction. And essentially what that means is if you look at it as a symptom of metabolic dysfunction, then if you address the underlying metabolic dysfunction, then you may lose weight as a side effect. Um, and essentially, what a ketogenic diet does, and we already know this from the studies, is that it changes the hormonal response to food that you're having. So, both immediately after a meal. Um, so, again, specifically talking about people with metabolic syndrome and metabolic dysfunction, but they can have exaggerated responses to high carb meals, which may mean extremely high insulin responses, extremely high glucose responses, and then that crash coming back down can influence appetite, even increased inflammatory responses to food, which may contribute to the whole insulin resistance sustaining issue. So, in terms of fat, the community that I hooked into emphasized fat to satiation. And basically, what that means is that whatever you're eating, you have your carb limit. So, under 20 grams of carbs, you have an appropriate amount of protein, however much works for you, basically. They were more moderate protein, and then however much fat in that meal you need to feel satiated afterwards. But the trick behind that is what you're basically doing is you're outsourcing that decision making to your own body. And another interesting thing I picked up from Amber O'Hearn is the interplay between satiation and metabolic rate. So once you start getting enough energy, basically, then your metabolic rate will go up as the body starts using that energy, and that can trigger satiation. But the other side of that is if you're in a weight loss mode, then some of the energy is going to be coming from your own fat, which may happen that you're just less hungry. you need less fat to become full because part of it is coming from your own body. And the other side of it is you could just feel more energetic and feel like going on a run after eating. You could be more fidgety. You could be more creative and interested in spending that energy in other ways. So the body is anthropomorphizing, but smart. It's very smart. And if it's in a good environment, it does often know how to deal with things and regulate itself out. Um, in terms of the fat content, like I said, it does vary by person. Generally, protein amounts can vary between 10% to 30%. Um, Percentage isn't a very good way to do it, but so it can vary with ketogenic diets and low carb diets, and the amount of fat can also vary. So part of it's going to vary by how much carbohydrate you're eating. If you're more low carb, like 100 grams of carbs per day, your fat is probably going to be lower because you don't need as much fat energy because you have energy coming from elsewhere. Um, and then also it depends on protein as well. So for people on carnivore diets, to simplify it a lot, so only eating animal products, the vast majority of their calories is going to be coming either from protein or fat. So if they're eating higher fat, they'll probably eat less protein. If they're eating more protein, they're probably eating less fat. So it just kind of balances out. So it could range between 70% fat to 85% fat. I've seen people who do even higher than that. Um, and usually those are people who are trying to address serious health issues, basically, where the deeper ketosis is apparently helpful for them. So I tend to be very high fat because I still use a ketogenic diet for depression management. I feel best when I'm in very, very deep ketosis. I also, as part of that lately, I've been taking exogenous ketones and integrating fasting in to help maintain very, very deep levels of ketosis. Um, but for somebody else who's feeling good, a lot of their metabolic health issues are addressed. The main one was maybe obesity or something. They may not need as high fat, or they may feel fine with slightly lower fat, higher protein, um, or just do as well with either one. I do know bodybuilders who use very, very high fat ketogenic diets, so it's all over the place. But it's up to personal preference and how you feel and what works best for you. And then in terms of cardiovascular disease, for me personally, I just track it. Like I get tests, I look at plaque in the carotid. I've had a CAC test done. So looking at the calcium within the arteries, I'll get another one of those done here pretty soon. I get regular blood work. I work with my doctor to keep an eye on it. And then also there is newer research coming out specifically looking at this question because I think it is a good question. Because, if somebody's cholesterol goes up on a ketogenic diet, for me, it didn't. I had high cholesterol before, it stayed about the same. Um, if it goes up, then it is a legitimate question to ask, what do I need to do about this? Do I need to do anything? Do I need to do closer monitoring? Is this putting me at higher risk of other health issues? And the response to that is sometimes, well, why don't you just go off of a ketogenic diet? For me, that means depression coming back, which isn't great. It also means poor management of lipedema. It also potentially means becoming obese again. A slew of other health issues that I don't particularly want to deal with. Other people use it for epilepsy, for autoimmune disease, for it's sometimes just not that easy to say, well, just go off of it if you're using it as a therapy. So it does need to be looked at. My friend and colleague, Dave Feldman, he started a study to look at this for people who saw very dramatic increases in cholesterol and ketogenic diets, and then getting baseline scans done of not only the calcified plaque in their arteries, but also the soft plaque, and then following up after 1 year. So we have the baseline data from them. We don't have the follow-up data yet. I would imagine it'll get published within the next year. I'm not on the study, so I don't know specifics of the timeline, but I would imagine around there. Um, and that is not going to be the end of any sort of story because it's a singular study. it's also in a specific group of people who are metabolically healthy. So what about people who are actively diabetic and on ketogenic diets long term? They're already at higher risk of heart disease. What about people who've been on it for 10 years, 20 years? I'm already at over 8 years at this point. So who knows? But at the very least, it asks an initial question to see if we need to be asking more questions, because let's say it comes back and it turns out they're not rapidly developing heart disease. Okay, well, again, what about those other groups of people? What about longer spans of time? So I say, it is an individual decision because it's an open question. Some people feel like there's enough evidence to say, okay, if you're going to be on a ketogenic long term, um, and your cholesterol has gone up, then you should be on medication. There are other people who say, well, we need to monitor you. So there's a whole range of opinions. I think all of them are valid because they're all going off of the information that we have. And ultimately, people have to decide what they're comfortable with. Some people are fairly comfortable with it as long as they get regular monitoring done. Some people are not. I know people who do take medication for it. Um, and I say, it's your body ultimately. And any long-term concern with anything, like with ketogenic diets, for example, because of a lot of the early studies with classical ketogenic diets for epilepsy, there's concerns over nutrient deficiencies. And it's like, okay, if that's a major concern for you, you can measure, you can measure that and keep an eye on it over time. I've gotten nutrient testing done. So, but the thing is, like, there are things that people can do about it. For some people who can tolerate it, they can increase the amount of carbs that they're eating slightly. So they're still low carb, but increasing to 50 grams of carbs per day, 75, 100. And that may be enough for the conditions that they have and to bring their cholesterol back down. Um, but yeah, I don't have a solid answer for anybody what they should do. I'm not a doctor, for one. And I genuinely do think it's just an individual choice of comfort level and concern level and what feels best for that person. But there is research coming down the line. That's the other aspect.
Well, Siobhan, I do very much appreciate listening to the extensive knowledge that you're imparting and your lived experience of not just the ketogenic diet, the low carb approach, but also your experience with lipedema, which will be a new condition to very many people out there, and hopefully it'll provide some inspiration to people who may have some similar symptoms. And on that note, could you give me some and the audience some resources possibly that they could go to online, be it for the ketogenic diet and or lipedema?
Yeah. So ketogenic diet in general, my recommended resource at this point is Gary Taubes' book, The Case for Keto. So Taubes is Taubes. It is fantastic. It goes over the newer research that's available. He has an excellent troubleshooting section where I love that it incorporates both try eating less fat, but then also try eating more fat, which is pretty much my experience in the community as well. You just try different things and see what sticks. So I love that book. I recommend it to everybody who's interested in just an overview of the situation. The other book I would recommend, particularly for interest with mental health disorders, is Georgia Eads' book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. Um, Very, very excellent. Lots of information about uh, aspects like food sensitivities that can come up. It's common with, or I don't know how common, but it does come up in the mental health community in terms of dairy sensitivity, nuts, stuff like that. It also comes up in the lipedema community, same food items. So I recommend it to people with lipedema also. Um, and for mental health, again, Metabolic Mind is a nonprofit that provides tons of information and resources on metabolic therapies for depression and bipolar and stuff like that. And then in terms of lipedema specifically, like I mentioned, I'm on the board of the Lipedema Project. That is a nonprofit. We focus on education and awareness and research into lipedema. And then also The for-profit arm is Lipedema Simplified, and that is where we provide a lot of like coaching sessions. We have coaches that work with us. So for people who need the additional support, additional community support, we have a community we call Tribe. That's all people with lipedema working together, providing support for each other, learning about the condition together. And then through those two, we also have free webinars all the time, and we have events that we put on as well. So lots of information about lipedema there. Another thing I almost forgot to mention, which would have been embarrassing, is next year we are releasing a book on lipedema. So I am one of the authors on the book. We have many, many specialist authors working on it. It's essentially a textbook for lipedema, but not just the science behind the condition, but also treatment options. What is the evidence-based approach for thinking about lipedema and addressing it? And it's written in such a way so that it's not only for researchers, it's also for patients and physicians as well.
And I will, as ever, pop all of those links in the show notes for this particular episode. Siobhan Huggins, absolute pleasure listening to you today. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And if you enjoyed that video, check out this video right here.